Let me take you back to the moment this whole mess began. Picture this: a quiet, peaceful morning in my little corner of Willow Ridge Estates. The air smelled fresh, birds chirped like they were auditioning for a symphony, and I was sipping coffee on my porch, enjoying the calm before life got, well, complicated. I've always loved living here because it's different from the rest of the neighborhood. My house sits on 5 acres of land that feels like a slice of wilderness tucked away from the cookie-cutter homes nearby. It's private, serene, and mine. All mine. There's even a gravel trail running through the woods behind my property. It's perfect for hiking or riding my ATV when I need some time to clear my head. At least it was perfect, until other people decided they wanted a piece of it too. One day, while checking the fence line along the edge of my property, I noticed something odd. Fresh tire tracks cutting across the dirt. At first, I thought maybe a delivery driver had taken a wrong turn, but then I saw more tracks. And footprints. Lots of them. That's when it hit me. Someone, or rather, someone's had been using my private trail without permission. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just kids being curious, right? But as I walked further along the path, I found plastic bottles and candy wrappers scattered around. Someone had even left tire ruts so deep they'd torn up parts of the ground. This wasn't harmless wandering. This was blatant disrespect. These weren't guests. They were invaders. So, I did what anyone would do. I put up a gate, a big, sturdy one with a heavy-duty padlock at the entrance to the trail. I also added no trespassing signs every few feet, just to make things crystal clear. Problem solved. Or so I thought. What I didn't realize was that closing off the trail would send shockwaves through the neighborhood. And not the good kind. The very next day, I heard shouting coming from outside. When I stepped out to see what was going on, there she was, Karen. You know the type. Perfectly styled hair, designer clothes, and a voice that could cut through steel if she really wanted it to. She was standing in front of the gate, yelling loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. "This is unacceptable," she shrieked, waving her arms dramatically. "Do you have any idea how inconvenient this is for everyone?" Inconvenient. For everyone. I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. This was my land, not a public highway. Did she honestly think I owed her access to my backyard? "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my tone calm despite the absurdity of the situation. "But this is private property. The trail runs through my land, and I don't want strangers using it." Her response was immediate and infuriating. With a smug smile that made my blood boil, she crossed her arms and said, "We'll see about that." And oh, how right she was. Little did I know, those 5 words would set off a chain reaction that turned my peaceful life upside down. Karen wasn't the kind of person you could ignore. She had a way of inserting herself into every situation, whether she was invited or not. And now, thanks to that gate I'd installed, she seemed determined to make my life as difficult as possible. After her dramatic outburst at the gate, Karen didn't just walk away and let it go. Oh no, that would have been too easy. Instead, she started showing up everywhere. If I went to the mailbox, she'd happen to be outside watering her flowers, and suddenly, we'd end up in a heated conversation about how unreasonable I was being. If I ran into her at the grocery store, she'd corner me in the produce aisle to lecture me about community spirit. It was exhausting. But what really got under my skin was how she twisted things around. To hear her tell it, I wasn't protecting my property. I was hoarding it. According to Karen, the trail had been used by residents for decades, which somehow made it public domain. Never mind that I paid good money for this land, or that the deed clearly stated it belonged to me. None of that mattered to her. All she cared about was convenience. And then there was the guilt trip. Oh, the guilt trip. Karen had a knack for making people feel like they were doing something wrong, even when they weren't. At one point, she told me, right in front of several neighbors, that I was ruining the neighborhood. Ruining it? How? By exercising my right to control who came onto my property. Apparently, saying no wasn't an option in Karen's world. The worst part, people listened to her. Not everyone, of course, but enough to make me uneasy. Some of my neighbors started avoiding me, like I was some kind of villain for daring to stand up to Karen. Others gave me pitying looks, as if they thought I was overreacting but didn't want to say so. Even Claire, my wife, began questioning whether putting up the gate had been worth it. "Why does it have to be such a big deal?" she asked one evening after another awkward encounter with Karen. "Can't you just take it down and move on?" I wanted to say yes. Believe me, I did. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. This wasn't just about a stupid trail. It was about principle. Letting Karen win meant giving up control of my own home, my own space. Once I caved on this, where would it stop? Would she demand I trim my trees next? Repaint my house because it clashed with hers? Still, as the days went by, Karen kept pushing. Every time I saw her marching toward my driveway, clipboard in hand and determination in her eyes, I braced myself for another round of accusations and demands. She called emergency HOA meetings to discuss the issue, sent emails filled with thinly veiled threats, and even tried to rally other neighbors against me. It felt like living in a pressure cooker, with tension building higher and higher. I half expected her to show up on my porch one day with a petition signed by everyone on the block. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. A move so bold, so outrageous, that it left me speechless. Because Karen wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. The day Karen crossed the line started out like any other. I was in my garage, tinkering with an old lawnmower that had been giving me trouble, when I heard a sharp knock on the door. When I opened it, 2 police officers stood there, their expressions unreadable. Behind them, arms crossed and lips pursed into a tight smile, was Karen. My stomach dropped. What on earth was going on? "Sir," one of the officers began, glancing between me and Karen, "we received a report that you've blocked access to public land." Public land. My jaw nearly hit the floor. "This is private property," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "It's been in my name for years. Here." I grabbed the deed from my desk and handed it over. The officer skimmed it briefly, nodding, but Karen wasn't about to let facts get in her way. "That trail has been used by residents for decades," she chimed in, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "It's essentially public domain now. Blocking it disrupts the entire community." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Decades. Public domain. None of that was true, and we both knew it. But Karen didn't care about truth. She cared about winning. And apparently, dragging the cops into this was her latest tactic. The officers exchanged a glance, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. Finally, one of them suggested we settle things legally. Translation: hire lawyers, file paperwork, and drag this mess through court. Great, just what I needed. A legal battle over something that should have been simple. But Karen wasn't finished yet. As the officers turned to leave, she shot me a smug grin. "Oh, and don't bother trying to remove the gate again," she added, her voice laced with warning. "Next time, I won't hesitate to call animal control." Animal control. I stared at her, dumbfounded. "What are you talking about?" She tilted her head innocently, as if she hadn't just threatened me. "Well, your property seems awfully wild, overgrown. Who knows what kind of dangerous animals might be lurking back there?" Her tone made it clear she wasn't concerned about wildlife. She was planting seeds of doubt, trying to paint me as some kind of reckless recluse. As they walked away, I closed the door and leaned against it, my mind racing. This was insane. Completely and utterly insane. How had things escalated so quickly? A week ago, all I'd done was put up a gate to protect my land. Now, I was being accused of harboring dangerous creatures and violating imaginary community rights. It felt like I'd stepped into some alternate reality where logic didn't exist. Karen's words echoed in my head. Next time, I won't hesitate to call animal control. Asterisk, she was serious. If I didn't play along with her demands, she'd escalate further. Maybe she'd claim I was running an illegal operation in my backyard, or accuse me of threatening her safety. Knowing Karen, nothing was off limits. I spent the rest of the day pacing the house, replaying the confrontation in my mind. Claire tried to calm me down, reminding me that Karen's threats were empty, that no one would actually believe her wild accusations. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. People listened to Karen. They trusted her. And if she kept spinning lies, who knew how far she'd go? That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something important. Karen thrived on chaos. She fed off drama, using fear and manipulation to get her way. Every move she made was calculated, designed to push me closer to breaking point. And if I wanted to win this fight, I couldn't let her rattle me. But staying calm wouldn't be easy, not when Karen had already proven she'd stop at nothing to get what she wanted. The next few days were a whirlwind of tension and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was watching me, waiting for her next opportunity to strike. Every time I stepped outside, I half expected to see her lurking nearby, clipboard in hand, ready to document some new offense. It was like living under a microscope, except the person holding the lens had no regard for fairness or truth. Claire kept urging me to back down. "Just take the gate down," she pleaded one evening as we sat at the kitchen table. "It's not worth all this stress." I wanted to agree with her. Really, I did. The thought of giving in and removing the gate crossed my mind more than once. But every time I imagined doing it, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Giving in wouldn't solve anything. It would only prove Karen right. She'd won without even having to try. And what would stop her from pushing harder next time? If I caved now, I'd lose more than just the trail. I'd lose my dignity, my sense of control over my own life. So instead of backing down, I decided to fight smarter. I started researching my rights as a property owner, poring over legal documents and consulting with friends who knew their way around these kinds of disputes. I also invested in security cameras, not because I thought they'd catch anything major, but because I wanted proof if Karen tried anything shady. You can't argue with video evidence, after all. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any stranger, they did. One afternoon, while checking the footage from the cameras I'd installed along the fence line, I noticed something odd. There was Karen, dressed in workout gear and sneakers, sneaking onto my property with a pair of bolt cutters in hand. My heart skipped a beat as I watched her approach the gate. She glanced around nervously before snapping the lock and stepping through. But here's the thing. Unbeknownst to her, I'd rigged the gate with an alarm system. As soon as she pushed it open, loud beeping filled the air, followed by flashing lights. Startled, Karen froze, panic washing over her face. Instead of running, though, she whipped out her phone and dialed 911. When the police arrived, again, I found myself standing toe-to-toe with Karen once more. This time, however, I was prepared. Holding up my phone, I played the footage for the officers, showing them exactly what had happened. Karen stammered and sputtered, trying to explain herself, but the video spoke for itself. "This is harassment," she finally blurted, pointing an accusing finger at me. "He set traps on his property to intimidate me." The officers exchanged skeptical glances. One of them turned to me and asked, "Did you tamper with her vehicle or physically threaten her?" "No," I replied firmly. "All I did was secure my property." She trespassed, and the alarm went off as a result. After a long pause, the officers told Karen she needed to leave. Her face flushed red with embarrassment as she stormed off, muttering threats under her breath. But I wasn't celebrating just yet. Something about her reaction told me this wasn't over. Karen didn't take losses well, and I knew she'd find another way to retaliate. As I stood there watching her retreat, I realized how far this feud had spiraled out of control. What started as a simple disagreement over a private trail had turned into a full-blown war of wills. And while I'd managed to expose Karen's trespassing, I couldn't shake the feeling that she still held cards I hadn't seen yet. The neighborhood was changing too. People whispered behind closed doors, taking sides in a conflict they barely understood. Some neighbors applauded my stand against Karen, calling her behavior outrageous. Others sided with her, convinced I was being unreasonable. The divide grew wider with each passing day, turning Willow Ridge into a powder keg of resentment and mistrust. Karen might have lost this round, but the battle was far from over. And as much as I hated to admit it, part of me wondered if anyone could truly win in a situation like this. The fallout from Karen's trespassing incident spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone seemed to know about it. Some neighbors clapped me on the back when they saw me outside, whispering things like, "Good for you for standing your ground." Others glared at me as if I'd committed some unforgivable crime. It was impossible to tell who was on my side and who wasn't. And honestly, it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. Willow Ridge wasn't the quiet, peaceful place it used to be. Now, it felt like a battleground where every interaction carried an undercurrent of tension. Karen, predictably, wasn't taking her defeat lying down. If anything, she came back stronger and meaner. Within days, anonymous notes started appearing on my doorstep. Most were vague threats. "You'll regret this," or "back off before it's too late." One particularly nasty message read, "No one likes a troublemaker." At first, I thought it was just Karen venting her frustration, but then things escalated. Someone egged my mailbox one night, leaving shards of shell and yolk dripping down the post. A few days later, I found deep scratches along the side of my car, as if someone had taken a key to it in anger. Claire was furious. "This has gone too far," she snapped after inspecting the damage to the car. "She's not just targeting you. She's making all of us miserable." She wasn't wrong. Living under constant threat took its toll. I started double-checking the locks on our doors at night, jumping at every unfamiliar sound outside. Even Claire began receiving nasty messages online, accusing her of being married to a selfish bully. It felt like we were living in a psychological thriller, except there was no clear villain. Just a woman so consumed by entitlement that she couldn't see how destructive her actions were. But here's the thing about bullies. They thrive on fear. And I refused to give Karen the satisfaction of seeing me crack. Instead, I leaned into the support I did have. To my surprise, not everyone in the neighborhood hated me. In fact, quite a few people were fed up with Karen's antics. One family admitted they'd signed her petition against the gate only because she pressured them into it. Another neighbor confessed they'd seen her sneaking onto private properties long before this whole mess started. Apparently, she'd been using other trails without permission too. Encouraged by their honesty, I decided to organize a small meeting. I invited a handful of trusted neighbors to sit down and talk about what was really happening in Willow Ridge. At first, they were hesitant, afraid of rocking the boat or drawing Karen's wrath. But once we got talking, the floodgates opened. Stories poured out about Karen demanding unreasonable changes to people's homes, about her throwing tantrums at HOA meetings, about her weaponizing rules to punish anyone who crossed her. Slowly but surely, cracks began to form in her carefully constructed image of perfection. Armed with these revelations, I reached out to a lawyer friend who specialized in property disputes. Together, we drafted a formal response to Karen's claims, complete with evidence proving the land was mine and always had been. We also filed a counter-complaint, accusing her of harassment and vandalism. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had the upper hand. Still, I knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly. She'd fought dirty up until now, and I doubted she'd change tactics anytime soon. But something shifted during those weeks of gathering allies and building my case. I stopped feeling like I was fighting alone. For the first time, I realized that standing up to Karen wasn't just about protecting my property. It was about reclaiming our neighborhood from her toxic influence. And that realization gave me hope. even as the storm clouds gathered overhead. As the conflict between me and Karen intensified, Willow Ridge began to feel less like a neighborhood and more like a war zone. The once friendly streets were now filled with whispered conversations and suspicious glances. People who had been cordial for years suddenly avoided each other, unsure of where loyalties lay. Karen, ever the master manipulator, doubled down on her efforts to turn public opinion against me. She organized community meetings that were anything but civil, more like kangaroo courts where she played prosecutor, judge, and jury all at once. At one particularly heated gathering, Karen stood in front of a room full of neighbors, waving papers and gesturing dramatically. "This isn't just about a trail," she declared, her voice dripping with manufactured outrage. "It's about respect. For our community, for our rules, and for each other." Her supporters nodded along, while those who disagreed shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I sat quietly in the back, watching as she painted herself as the victim and me as the villain. But this time, I wasn't alone. The small group of neighbors who had confided in me earlier decided to speak up. One by one, they rose to challenge Karen's narrative. A young couple recounted how she had bullied them into repainting their front door because it didn't match her vision of cohesiveness. An elderly man revealed that she'd fined him repeatedly for having a bird feeder in his backyard, a violation of some obscure HOA rule no one else cared about. Each story chipped away at Karen's facade, exposing her for what she truly was, a bully hiding behind a mask of authority. Karen tried to brush off their accusations, dismissing them as exaggerations or misunderstandings. But the cracks in her armor were showing. For every neighbor she intimidated, another found the courage to push back. By the end of the meeting, the room was divided, some still clinging to Karen's side, others openly questioning her motives. It was clear that her grip on the neighborhood was slipping. Outside of the meetings, things grew even stranger. Late one night, I heard strange noises coming from the edge of my property. When I went to investigate, I discovered someone had cut down one of my trees, a mature oak that had stood near the gated trail for decades. Its branches lay scattered across the ground, hacked apart with an axe. My stomach churned as I stared at the destruction. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a message. Someone wanted me to know they could reach me anytime, anywhere. Claire was furious when I told her what happened. "This has to stop," she said through gritted teeth. "We can't keep living like this." She was right. Something had to give, and soon. I contacted the police again, providing photos of the damaged tree and sharing the mounting evidence of harassment. While they couldn't pin everything on Karen directly, the pattern was undeniable. Her behavior was escalating, and the authorities were finally starting to take notice. Meanwhile, the HOA board itself began to fracture under the weight of the drama. Several members resigned, citing personal reasons, while others openly criticized Karen's leadership. Even her closest allies started distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with her increasingly erratic actions. For the first time, I saw glimpses of doubt in her eyes, a flicker of vulnerability beneath her polished exterior. Still, Karen refused to back down. She hired a lawyer to file a formal complaint against me, claiming I was violating community access rights, a term she seemed to have invented. In response, I presented my own legal team with irrefutable proof of my ownership, along with testimonies from neighbors who had witnessed her bullying firsthand. The battle moved from the streets of Willow Ridge to the courtroom, where the truth would finally come to light. As the days turned into weeks, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. What started as a simple disagreement over a private trail had spiraled into something far bigger, a reckoning not just for Karen, but for the entire neighborhood. Friendships had fractured, trust had eroded, and the once idyllic community now bore scars that might never fully heal. Yet amidst the chaos, there was hope. Neighbors who had stayed silent were finding their voices. Boundaries were being redrawn, not just on maps, but in relationships and expectations. And though the fight wasn't over yet, I knew one thing for certain. Karen's reign of control was crumbling. All it took was one person standing firm to show everyone else that change was possible, even if it came at a cost. The day of the final showdown arrived, and it felt like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. The courtroom was small but packed with people, neighbors curious to see how this drama would unfold, reporters eager for a juicy story, and of course, Karen herself, sitting at the plaintiff's table looking as polished as ever. Her lawyer argued passionately about community rights and shared access, painting me as some kind of tyrant, bent on ruining Willow Ridge. My lawyer countered with cold, hard facts. Property deeds proving my ownership, security footage showing Karen trespassing, and testimonies from neighbors who had finally found the courage to speak out against her. When it was my turn to take the stand, I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained everything that had happened. From the tire tracks on my land to the threats and vandalism. I showed the court photos of the damaged tree, the slashed car tires, and the anonymous notes left on my doorstep. For once, Karen didn't have a snappy comeback or a smug smile to hide behind. She sat rigid in her seat, her perfectly manicured nails tapping nervously on the table. The judge listened carefully, asking pointed questions and flipping through documents before delivering the verdict. In the end, the ruling was clear. The trail was on my private property, and Karen had no legal grounds to demand access. Not only that, but she was ordered to pay damages for defamation and vandalism, a blow that hit her where it hurt most, her wallet and her pride. Karen stormed out of the courtroom without saying a word, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. I wanted to feel victorious, triumphant even, but instead I felt drained. The months of tension, sleepless nights, and endless arguments had taken their toll. While the legal battle was over, the emotional scars remained, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. In the weeks that followed, Willow Ridge began to heal, albeit slowly. Some neighbors reached out to apologize for doubting me, admitting they'd been too afraid to stand up to Karen sooner. Others quietly distanced themselves, unsure how to rebuild trust after taking sides. A few families decided to sell their homes and move away, unable to shake the feeling that the community they'd loved was gone forever. As for Karen, she didn't stick around long enough to face the fallout. Within a month, a for sale sign appeared in her front yard. When the house sold quickly, at a loss, according to local real estate agents, rumors swirled that she'd already joined another HOA board somewhere else. Whether true or not, it brought a grim sense of satisfaction, knowing she wouldn't be terrorizing us anymore. Standing on my porch one evening, watching the sunset filter through the trees, I realized something important. This fight wasn't just about a gate or a trail. It was about drawing boundaries, not just on maps, but in life. It taught me that standing up for what's right isn't easy, and it often comes at a cost. Friendships may fray, tempers may flare, and peace may feel impossibly distant. But sometimes, losing yourself is worse than losing the battle. Willow Ridge will never be the same, and maybe that's okay. Change isn't always comfortable, but it's necessary. And while I can't say I'm proud of everything that happened, I am proud of one thing. I didn't back down. I stood firm, even when it felt like the world was against me. And in doing so, I reminded everyone, including myself, that fairness and justice still matter, no matter how hard people try to stomp them out. Sometimes, fighting for what's yours doesn't bring happiness. It brings change. And sometimes, that's enough.